Hi friends, Lisa Curry with Greenhookstudio here, and today I want to show you an alternate technique for casting on for an arm knit scarf or blanket. I've been arm knitting over the years and even teaching some classes, and each time I've used the long tail cast on knitting method, and it seems to be the thing that most people struggle with in the class. So just recently I've started teaching arm knitting using a crochet chain cast on, and it's been much more successful. So that's what I'm going to show you today. So grab some big chunky yarn. This is Bernat Blanket Big, and take off any watches, bracelets, or jewelry that might snag on the arm knitting, and let's get to it. All right, let's get down to business with our chunky yarn and our casting on. So I'm going to take a length of the yarn. I like to pull from the center. This one kind of threw up for me, but I like to pull from the center so the ball doesn't roll around the whole time. So I'm going to take some yarn and I'm going to make a slip knot. So let's move this out of the way so it's not confusing. So I'm going to make a slip knot so it's crossed over. And then I'm going to pull it back up through to make a slip knot. And I want this slip knot to be about the size of my wrist, but not too tight or too loose. If it's too loose, then your blanket or scarf is going to look more like a net than a knit garment or item. But if it's too tight, you won't be able to slide it back off of your wrist. So you got to find that happy medium. And because this is a slip knot, you can slide it using the long tail to make it tighter. And if that's too loose or too tight, you can pull on the shorter tail or the knot to slide it back down. So I want mine to be pretty snug, but be able to get it off. All right, so there's my starting loop, my slip knot. Now I'm going to make a crochet chain using my hands. So I'm going to grab this working yarn. So this is the tail and this is the working yarn. I'm going to pull it through and pull this old loop, this first slip knot loop, off of my hand and pull the new one through and make sure that one's the right size. So then I have two loops, one off my wrist and one on. And I'm going to do that same thing over and over until I have a chain that is the width of what I want for a blanket, which is between 25 and 20 stitches. And for a scarf, depending on how chunky your yarn is, with this super chunky, I would do probably 6 stitches. If I were using a thinner yarn, I might use 10. So that's up to you and the look that you're going for. So for this demo video, I'm going to show you what 10 looks like. So I've got 2, 1, 2. I'm going to pull this through again. Now you can do this without putting your wrist back through it, but I like to put my wrist back through to make sure that it's the right size. And then I pull it through again. Pull more yarn out first. Okay, so I've got my 2 stitches on here, third is on my wrist. This is stitch number 4 that I'm pulling through and sticking my wrist in to make sure it's the right size. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Once again, I'm pulling this working yarn through and then onto my wrist to make sure that it's the right size. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You can also kind of hold on to this or the chain right below to make sure that you just don't pull it too loose. So that's 7, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 is how many I'm doing for this. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, besides pull more yarn out so I'm ready, is I'm going to make sure the chain is all facing the same direction. You don't want your chain to be twisted, so that you can see where your loops are and where you need to be going next. So it looks kind of like a braid, but you can see loop, 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 loop. These are your chains. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, and those are the holes that we're going through. Sometimes it's hard to see, and if you don't go through the exact same hole each time, like say on this one, you go through this hole, and on this one, you go through this part of the chain. That's really okay because this is just the base chain for the bottom of your scarf or blanket. Okay, so now we finished the crochet part and we're going to start knitting. So I'm going to use this 10th chain as my first loop, my first knitting stitch on my wrist. So there's my first loop. Now I'm going to stick my hand through this next chain, number 9, stick my fingers through so that I can pull a loop up without working yarn and make a stitch onto my wrist. And I'm going to do that all the way down the line. It helps me to lay it flat on the table so that I know where my stitches are and that my chain is not twisted. So going into the next hole, grab the working yarn, pull it through and onto my wrist. All the way down the line. Next hole. And again, make them pretty taut onto your wrist, but not so tight that you can't slide them off, because that's what you do in arm knitting. So we're going to go through, make another stitch, last one, dive through, pull a stitch up, and put it on my wrist. Okay. So there I have my first row. Now, to continue arm knitting, once you've cast on, you are going to take this working yarn. So you're going to ignore this chain, this tail here. Just pretend it doesn't exist until the end, very end. All right. So I'm going to take the working yarn and I'm going to grab it with my right hand that has the loops on it. And I'm going to slide the old loop off, pull a new loop up, and put it on my other hand. And I'm going to do that same thing all the way across. One thing that's very important is if you want to tight knit, just like keeping them tight on your wrist, you also want to keep your arms close together so you don't stretch out a space in between the stitches. So continuing across, I'm going to grab this tail, pull the old loop off, make a new loop and don't drop it, and put it on my new hand, new side. Old loop off, over my hand, new loop goes on the new hand, and keep it tight all the way across. Old loop off, new loop up, hand through. Old loop off, new loop up and through. Old loop off, new loop up and through. Old loop off, new loop up and through. Okay, so there we have 2 rows now. Chain, 1, 2. Now, if you are doing a blanket, you would have 20 to 25 across, so that would pretty much fill your arm. If you are doing a scarf, especially with the super chunky, you make it about as tall as you. so that you can wrap it twice around your neck, or if you're using a super bulky, you may only need to go once around your neck. So that may be about 10 rows. For a longer scarf that goes around twice, that would be about 20 rows. And I will put in the description how many skeins of which recommended yarns for these projects. And before I finish up this video, I will show you also how to bind off. So pretend that you've made as many rows as you want to for your blanket or your scarf. Now, to bind off, you want to make sure that you have enough leftover yarn to finish a complete row. So watch out for that as you finish your project. Okay, so to finish up, bind off, you're going to take this tail, pull it through, and make a new loop just like a normal row. So old loop off, new loop up, and across. Now, instead of continuing a row, you're going to take the back loop over the front loop and drop it. So then you have one loop on your wrist. Old loop off, new loop up, and I've got 2. So I'm going to take the back loop over the front loop, and back to 1 on this wrist. And I'm starting to create a braid on this side. So I make another stitch, old loop off, new loop up and over. Then I go back over the front and drop it. Always drop your old loops. Do not put them anywhere else. All right, let's make another stitch. New loop up through onto this wrist. Then I drop the old loop, first old loop over the newest loop. Get some more yarn here. All right. Make a new stitch. Drop the old loop over. So I have 1 left. Make 1 more stitch. Back loop over the front. And then I just have this 1 left. 1 loop. And what you can do, chenille type yarns actually break, so you don't even need scissors for this part. And then you pull this tail through your last stitch and pull it tight to make a knot. So there I have my 3-row scarf blanket sample. What you'll do then with your finished, with your tails for your finished piece is you're just going to weave them in back and forth to hide them in the chunky yarn. I like to make mine go one direction and then back the other, just to hide them inside. And then you do the same with the other tail. Now, if you are making an infinity scarf and want to sew your ends together, make sure either your starting tail or your finishing tail is long enough for you to use to sew the 2 sides together. And you would just zigzag through those, almost like when I was weaving through. If you have any questions about arm knitting, I am happy to answer those. I would also love to see any of your finished products, or projects rather, on Instagram or Facebook. You can tag me at greenhookstudio. I would love to see all your projects. So happy arm knitting with a crochet start, and thanks for watching this video.